Recently, Linus and Luke from Linus Tech Tips announced they're going to be doing a switching to Linux challenge. And the way they made it sound is they were going to be switching to Linux mainly for their gaming system. Now, obviously, they probably do other things on those computers as well. I think Linus mentioned that he does the WAN show from that system, but the main purpose they have is for gaming. And if one of them switches back to Windows, then there'll be a penalty for that person. They haven't fully decided on that penalty, but one of the suggestions they had, which I actually really like, is dyeing their hair into like the 4-quadrant colors on the Windows 7 logo, which I think would be kind of hilarious. But if you're doing gaming on Linux, this is honestly the best time for it. The Steam Deck is on the horizon. Linux gaming is getting easier and easier. Honestly, there hasn't been a better time to do this challenge. I am incredibly happy to see this happen, and I sort of wanted to throw my thoughts in on the matter and on some of the things they sort of got wrong about their perception of Linux as it stands. They are both admittedly not that experienced with modern Linux. Linus has used Linux a couple of times in videos, and Luke said that he used Linux like 10 or so years ago. So they did have some preconceived notions about, what it would be like, and not all of them were completely wrong. One of the things that Luke mentioned was that updating Discord was kind of a hassle. And while it is certainly easy enough on something like Ubuntu, if you're running a rolling release like Arch, updating Discord can be an absolute pain. So Discord will have an internal version that gets handled by its internal updater, but it will also have a package version. And sometimes if you don't update the package for Discord, the internal updater won't actually go and update to the latest version and basically just get stuck there. As I said, generally fine on a stable release. Arch, I see this at least once every couple of months. Either way, though, you could just run it in your web browser and it just stops being an issue. Now, another thing they mentioned is inconsistencies between, I guess, the help resources for certain distros. So you might find a fix for something on, say, Ubuntu, but then not be able to find the same fix on a distro like, say, Mint. Now, that is true, but I think this comes down to the fact that a lot of people simply do not understand what a Linux distro is and what actually differentiates them. So Linux Mint and Ubuntu are basically the same thing with different programs installed. This would be like saying that your mate's version of Windows 10 isn't the same version of Windows 10 as yours because they decided to install Steam and you have the Epic Game Store instead. They're still both Windows 10, it's just that the software you have is a little bit different. So if a fix exists for Ubuntu, what people usually say when it's a fix for Ubuntu is it's usually a fix for a program installed on Ubuntu. And if that program is also installed on Mint or Arch or Manjaro, the fix 9 times out of 10 is going to be exactly the same. There are some distro-specific issues, like say, the config file is set up wrong for your distro, or something is broken with your specific distro's package manager, maybe a kernel issue with the slightly customized version for your distro, but most other things, if it says this is a fix for Arch, it'll probably work on anything else. If you actually know what programs you have installed, finding fixes for those specific programs is basically dead simple, assuming you're not using some random obscure thing that has 3 stars on GitHub. Now, I know I'm going to have someone in the comments saying, but Brodie, there's more differences between distros than just that. I'm aware. Sure, but most of the time, it's just related to the software. Recently, there's been a lot of focus on Steam and Proton and the absolutely amazing work that Valve is doing to get thousands upon thousands of the titles in their marketplace, not just absolute garbage titles, but actually good games working under Linux. And that's great. That's great and all, but I think a lot of people don't know about the other tools that exist under Linux that make it so you can play things outside of Steam. So they were worried about game libraries like, say, Ubisoft's library, but Ubisoft Connect will work through Lutris, or things like the Origin Store, which will also work through Lutris, or Battle.net, which will also work through Lutris. Now, a lot of the games in these libraries will not work because they'll either have like anti-cheat or other reasons why they just will not work under Linux. But you can still try it, and that's something that is available. Then when it comes to things like the Epic Store, you can use the Heroic Launcher. I know that Lutris just isn't as exciting as Proton, and as such, doesn't really get that much attention, but I really wish more people outside of the Linux gaming world would talk about Lutris being an option. I know that Proton is like the big cool thing that everyone is hyped about right now, but there are other things you can use, and Lutris will let you do things like play the standalone version of Final Fantasy XIV. All it's doing is configuring Wine for you, but Wine is a pain in the ass to configure, and having some automatic way to do this honestly makes this very simple. Then they had a more general concern that I know some people are not going to like, but I fully agree with, because this is sort of the basis of my entire channel. Linux is going to require a lot of unnecessary bullshit to get stuff done, and some things are just going to take longer. You can disagree with that, and sure, Windows has a lot of problems itself, but you cannot deny there is some things under Linux which just are less convenient than they need to be. There's programs that can address this in some ways, but in a lot of cases, that just doesn't exist. Take things like video editing. Video editing under Linux, you can certainly get a lot of stuff done, but to get the same sort of effects that you could do in something like Premiere, there's not really anything at that level. You'd have to sort of build it up manually. Or bring it back to gaming, sometimes a game just won't work with the default way that Proton is configured. Sometimes you have to include some launch options, sometimes a file will just be named weirdly, and you have to go and like rename the file. Sometimes you have to try out Proton GE, and then maybe try out like different versions of it with different launch options and dicking around with stuff like that. Like, sometimes getting a game to work can just be a bit of a mess. Whereas on Windows, basically any modern game, I know older games, not always the case, especially really old games, but any modern game, usually you just click play and it works. Linux is slowly getting to that point, but we're not there yet. When it comes to the distro, at this stage, Luke is probably going to be using Mint because he's used Mint in the past and just wants to go back with something somewhat familiar. Linus being, Linus, not really have used Linux before, he decided to make the mistake of giving the live chat some level of responsibility and gave them a poll, and also let them go and add some extra things to the poll. So by the end, the poll had Pop, Mint, Arch, Debian, Ubuntu, Manjaro, Elementary, and Gentoo. Now, Linus was aware that Arch was going to be a meme option. He put it there himself. Gentoo was one of the things that he let his chat add. Now, Gentoo never should have been on that list. I know that both Arch and Gentoo are great distros. I use Arch myself, and Gentoo seems great as well. But if he wants to get work done and not quit the challenge on the first day, Arch and Gentoo should not be on that list. I think the way that Gentoo made it on that list is that at some point, Linus had heard the name Gentoo before. He knew that a distro named Gentoo existed, but he didn't know anything about it. So he just assumed this was going to be an easy distro to use. I don't really have any problem with any of the other suggestions. Some people have said that Debian probably shouldn't have been on that list, but it's not really that big of a deal. One problem that did happen, though, is that Linus heard the name Fedora and thought that Fedora was just a meme distro, a meme suggestion, but it's not. If you know anything about Fedora, Fedora is a perfectly valid distro to use. This sort of comes down to Linus's lack of experience with Linux. Now, luckily, this isn't a couple of years ago, and Linus actually has an employee that is well-versed in Linux. It is the man that everyone loves. They've got shrines to him and stuff. It's Anthony. So, Anthony gave Linus suggestions of Pop! OS and Endeavour. Now, Pop! OS makes sense because Anthony is a really big System 76 fan, And he doesn't run Pop! OS himself, he actually runs Arch, but he does really like what System 76 has to offer. Endeavor is something that I hadn't actually heard of and needed to actually go and look into a bit. Basically, someone correct me if I'm wrong here, but what Endeavor seems to be is Manjaro minus the janky repos that break the AUR. So this would allow Linus to go and actually install stuff from the AUR and actually have it work like he was on base Arch. If I had to give my suggestion, I would say just go with Pop! OS. I would never recommend for someone like Linus to go with a rolling release, even things like Manjaro or Endeavor, which are going to be easier than something like base Arch. The problem is that if during that time he's using it, there is some sort of keychain issue that breaks the repos, then that's basically enough of a reason for him to just completely give up the challenge. I can't expect someone who is as busy as him to sit down for an hour or two trying to diagnose what this issue is and trying to fix it, especially when they just don't have any experience actually working with Linux. Pop! OS just seems like the safer bet to go with. And sure, you can say Pop! OS isn't great, but for someone with basically no experience with Linux, it's gonna be fine. When I initially saw this posted over on Reddit, I saw a lot of people with really, really dumb takes. I know it's crazy, it's Reddit. Dumb takes, that's crazy. People saying things like Linus doesn't know anything about Linux, he's a bad representative for it, he'll show off Linux gaming in a bad way, he's trash talked Linux in the past, he shouldn't be talking about Linux now, and I don't really understand any of this sentiment. Linus, here's a 14 million sub channel. That is a lot of people who can actually see what Linux gaming is like in its current state. It's going to have some problems, absolutely, but those problems are problems that do exist and should be talked about, and they might not actually be real problems, but if they're problems that seem to exist from the perspective of someone who plays games on Windows, they are still problems worth addressing, and at the end of the day, I think this is ultimately a good thing. And hopefully we'll stop at least some people acting like Linux gaming is still in 2005, where basically nothing worked. It's not like that. Almost 17,000 games on Steam work. That is a lot of games. I will absolutely be following the videos that come out in this saga. I won't be making, like, responses to them, but I will be watching them in my free time, and I would recommend you go and do the same. Let me know what you think about Linus and Luke doing this challenge in the comment section down below, and if you like this video and you want to support the channel and become one of these amazing people over here, please go check out my Patreon subscribers, generally Pay, linked in the description down below. I've got a podcast called Tech Over Tea, available basically anywhere. I've got a gaming channel called Brodie Robertson Plays, where I live stream twice a week, upload about files to YouTube Shorts, and this channel is also available over on Odyssey. That's going to be it for me, and I'm out.